When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back, and this is episode 130. Build APIs fast with Strapi.io. I'm Matt, that's Mike, and this week we'll be discussing what APIs are and how to make them using Strapi.io. Now, if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us on our Discord server, or just share this with your friends. And a brief reminder that the Weekly Goals app will be in beta shortly, hopefully, and you can go and track that progress on our public Trello. Link is on our Twitter somewhere. I know that's not a great advertisement, but I will hopefully make it more available if I remember. Now, Mike, you wrote out this episode. You know all about the APIs. You know all about the Strapi.io. So please, sir, take it away.
Okay. So why do we need APIs? Simple websites like online businesses or something like that, they might not need something that has API level control. And just to get into a more general conversation, APIs are application programming interfaces, and essentially what that means is that they allow an application to talk to another application, or an application to talk to a backend, if that makes more sense. So front-end, back-end communication, that's mostly driven through API integrations. And again, simple website, simple business card website, especially if you're making something for like a coffee shop, or maybe not even a coffee shop, like a mechanic shop, something that's not going to change very often, and you want to just kind of control the changes yourself as the web developer, that's probably not going to need any sort of APIs. But other than that, anything where a CMS is involved, anything where any sort of create, read, update, or delete CRUD functionality, those are the kinds of things where APIs come in handy. And if you think about it, I think most applications out there are most likely API driven, whether it's WordPress, whether it's, Shopify, whether it's WooCommerce, which is WordPress, whether it's Webflow, all that has APIs working. Sometimes you don't notice the APIs, which is great. But regardless, that's kind of how it communicates with the database. A lot of the times, another kind of common fact with APIs is anytime you have to read, store, or modify anything inside of a database, you need something in the middle to kind of make that a little bit easier for you, because no one's kind of, going straight from the web and reading directly to like a MySQL database on a server. I don't know if you can do that. Correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone's ever literally directly written from JavaScript to MySQL in a database. I don't think it's possible. I think there's probably a lot of reasons why it shouldn't be possible if it is, because of security implications, because you don't want to, SQL inject right from the browser without a middleware that can actually detect it and stop it. But regardless, anytime you want to modify a database, that's going to do an API. And again, just, creating a regular, let's talk to-do list application. Just creating a to-do seems like a very simple operation. Like you just need to create an object that it can be stored somewhere and then later accessed. But as soon as you start thinking about it a little bit more intensely and a little bit more programmatically, that like when you're actually starting to build out the process, it actually becomes there's a lot of intricacies that we kind of forget. And I'm just going to list a few of them that something like a CMS or something like a headless CMS will have thought of for you and helped you with it. But if you were building it on your own with PHP or Node, you have to think about it yourself. So you're going to have to think about what kind of endpoints the application will need. So what does that mean? When your front end needs to communicate with your back end, what are those communications? What do they need to be? Do you need to communicate with your backend to get all the data from the database? Do you need to communicate with your backend to get certain data only for a certain user? Do you need to communicate with your backend to create data? Do you need to communicate to edit, delete, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? You need to think about every single endpoint that you need to create when you're making one of these APIs, when you're making a system that controls APIs. then what users should have access to to what endpoint. So different endpoints should have different authentication requirements, correct? So let's say you were the user that created the to-do list, right? Or a to-do. And maybe your to-do lists are publicly shareable. So you want people to be able to see the to-do, but maybe not edit the to-do that you created. And that requires permissions handling, right? So again, how do you build that in? What do you use to kind of give permission to yourself, but not give permissions to another user, but give them still permissions to be able to at least see the to-do? You can see where this gets a little bit complicated, even when it's something simple. Then you need to think about, again, how will the user create, or how will someone create an account so that they can go in and actually be authenticated and be able to create their own to-dos. So there's got to be an endpoint for, creating an account. There's got to be an endpoint for logging in to an account. And then there's got to be response from your server that contains some sort of token or something that you can use then on next requests. So on the request to edit, you would send in a token of the authenticated user, and the server would have to check that token and make sure that you can make that operation. It's again that who has access to what. Again, this is a rabbit hole. As soon as you start going down into it, if anyone's ever out there built an API from scratch in Node or PHP, this is something that they've had to battle. This is something that they've had to go through. And at first, I guarantee you, if they were just kind of doing their own thing and thought, hey, let's just do this on my own, they were like, oh, this is going to be easy. I'll just create, one or two different routes and it'll all be good. And then all of a sudden it just snowballs on them and they have a code of 2,000 lines just to control someone's to-do list. And which is fine. And doing it yourself sometimes is better because you have so much control. You have so much deliberate control, especially for access, and deliberate control for what is running and what isn't running in the back end. But again, if you're a one-man team and you're doing a full stack project and you have a limited amount of time, it's going to be a very time-consuming process, especially if you're not aware. And we'll talk about how Strapi can help with that in a little bit. I just want to go through a couple more scenarios where an API helps, or when you kind of have to think about what an API is. Then the other thing is some APIs need to be available to the general public, right? So let's say you're doing a My Weekly Growth Goals application. I need to make sure that all the weekly growth goals that are made are available to everyone going to the site without any authentication, right? But on the other hand, I also don't want people to just go to the site and just start hitting the site and all of a sudden overload my backend. So I need to put in some sort of, DDoS control on the backend to make sure that even though this API is available to the general public, they can't overload it. So again, it's something that you have to think about. And you need to think about how the data will be associated with each other. So when you create a weekly goal, back to the weekly growth goals application, I have to make sure that I know who created that weekly goal. So I need to make sure that when I'm sending the weekly growth goal payload to be created, I'm also sending the user that's creating it with it. And on the back end, I need to be able to store that user with the weekly goal, and then also make it sure that it's queryable to be the point to the point where if a user wants to see all their own weekly growth goals, they can then go in and search for those goals in the back end and then show it on the front end. So stuff like that. Again, I don't want to overwhelm anyone because this seems probably a lot that I'm throwing at you for APIs, but those are general kind of questions that you have, or purposes of APIs in a general, very simple application. It gets much more complicated than that when you start going down rabbit holes for administration control, or working with multiple different integrations. If you're working with your company's corporate database, and then you have to merge in some sort of new database that comes in, maybe from a Salesforce team, that's when stuff gets to be even more hairy with APIs. But regardless, it's all kind of doable, even if you do it just straight from scratch, again, with just Node.js or PHP. It's all doable, but there are tools that can help you, at least especially get started for smaller projects. And that's kind of what I want to talk about with what Strapi is and what it can do.
And I think that the breakdown you just did is actually very critical, because a lot of people will only really associate APIs with the general public APIs. So things like if you're trying to pull from if you want to make a movie app where you're going to track a movie collection, let's say, there's a bunch of movie and TV databases, or more specifically, a bunch of TV databases and movie databases with public APIs associated with them, so that you yourself are not tracking all these movies from the beginning of time, whenever you want to manage them from. You're not tracking all the metadata, like when they came out, why they, or what their descriptions are, why they came out in certain places at certain times, was there translations. There's tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of data that people might want to learn about, especially in a collections app, or track. And then you also have variants of the movie. Like I said, if you have a Spanish translation of an English movie, or vice versa, and just like choosing random sort of metadata, there's tons and tons of metadata associated with different TV shows, especially because there's so many TV shows, or so many TV episodes, let alone so many TV shows. So like you can't manage that data. And so to me, as a person who like rarely uses APIs, or like at least kind of, you would think you rarely use them, you would think, oh, like an API is something that is general to the public, where if I want to make a movie app or a TV app, a TV show managing app, I'm going to pull from these databases that have a public API. But the API goes further than that in thinking that, there's effectively an API within WordPress even, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Mike, but if you think about WordPress, you're just thinking, oh, everything's all together, right? So I'm on WordPress, I'm using the editor, I've like logged in, and I'm going to add a blog post. Well, the blog post is going to be stored, somewhere in the database. It's going to be tracked with, I logged in. So there you go. So I created the user account somehow. I logged in. I have a profile, so my profile is associated with being allowed to do certain things on the website. And so whenever I go and change something in the database, like some users will be able to update plugins. Some users will not be able to update plugins. Some users will be able to change to add new plugins. Some people will not. Some people won't have any sort of permission at all, other than to change their own profile and then change their own blog posts or add new blog posts, and they won't be able to edit other people's. So there's like this varying sort of engine underneath, and it's this API that's communicating between effectively the WordPress front end of you editing, and then also seeing the site as a customer or as a logged in user, because there is a difference, and then the database, of course, which is effectively populating the website. And that's why if you were to just take WordPress with no database, like let's say you take an existing site, you just, whatever, I don't know, you forget to back up the database. I mean, you're going to have a little bit of information, but you're not really going to have much, if any, depending on your situation. Maybe you'll have like, if you cache your website, maybe you'll have like the cache or something, if it's cached locally as like static files or whatever. There's a million and one ways to configure a WordPress thing, but you're not going to have that sort of backbone, that database. You're not going to have that, period. And so that's sort of the reason why I'm going on this kind of rant, is because, APIs to a lot of people are just solely the public ones or the private ones, where it's like, oh, I really want to get into this app's API, so I have to like apply for the program, or oh, I would love to pull from this video game database, or I would love to pull from this movie database or this TV database, as I've said. And that's sort of what the marketing term, I would say, API has become, and that's exactly what I would think like most people think it is. And people understand as well, in general, what an API is. They understand, it's this interface in which I type in certain commands like, I don't know, tv.getMovie or whatever it is, and then it gets me a random movie. They understand that they're typing that in, and that's instructing this public API to go and get a random movie from X database on the internet. They understand that, but I think that it's really crucial for people to understand that APIs are actually sort of everywhere. There's a lot of them, and they're in a lot of different applications that you wouldn't even think of. One thing that I'm going to actually bring it back to is Mike and I were in college. We did embedded programming. Now, not to get into the weeds of it, but one of the things that we did was we learned how to make drivers. Literally, like if you think about it, like Windows drivers, except on a really small scale, where we have like a chip on like a very simple circuit board, and we want it to blink an LED. So one of the ways to do it is to turn on a register. Again, not going to get into the weeds of all these terms, but you want to turn on a register. So you can normally just constantly reset that register, or you can make your own driver that says like LED1.on or whatever, right? LED1, like turn LED1 on. So it's easier. Effectively, you've made a driver. It's very similar to an API there. It might even be considered an API. I don't know. Again, not getting into the weeds, but it's very, very similar to that. And then another thing to Mike's point is, we learned how to make that driver just for that simple LED, but then our teacher gave us his core files that controlled the whole chip more than just the LED. Why? Because like Mike said, APIs are sort of runaways. There's tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of functionality and tons of little things that you need to consider. and it can easily become a runaway. So our teacher taught us how to do the most basic, just so we understood, you're making a driver here and these are the core files. And then he just gave us the core files and was like, this is how you control more advanced things than just the LEDs, because I wrote these core files out. And the core files were like a collection of drivers and blah, blah, blah that we used in order to control other things like the register, or like turning things off and on, and, moving things around or turning on interrupts and everything else. And so the same sort of thing goes with APIs. You might think my API is just like, oh, my API is just going to be to access movies. It's like, you're right, but then who's adding these movies? Like, are they going into PHP my admin and going into an SQL database and then actually typing into the SQL database directly, like new entries? Like, that's pretty bizarre. Are they writing the commands and then like doing an import? Also bizarre. So there needs to be an interface there where people can add movies. But wait, you can't have the public adding movies. You need to have only authorized users, people that maybe own that database or work at that site or whatever it is. And so you're like, well, I need to have an authenticated thing. Oh, okay. So do we need one API with a separation between public and private, or do we actually want complete separation and have two APIs where the public API doesn't touch the private and the private's just done with some sort of CMS, but then the actual public API is literally that, like literally designed just for the public. It's completely separate so that there's no accidental bleed between private and public. And this is where that, like, just touching on it, I'm already getting into the weeds of it. And so this is why I think that having a breakdown like this is super important, because APIs have really sort of become a marketing term, in my opinion, like a marketing term to the technical people, not to the common, person that just opens up their iPad and reads the news, but a person that quite literally that's in the industry. Like API, if you haven't really touched it, has really become a marketing term for those public APIs. And I think that it's really crucial that that it really does go beyond that. And chances are you have or are currently using an API without even really knowing it.
Yes, exactly. And I think you broke it down really well there too, in the sense that like a public facing API and a private API that you build, or a CMS that you build, are essentially the same thing, right? Because of the public facing API, yes, it had to think about a few more things than your just private facing API that's used to manage content. But essentially, it still ends up the same way, and you still consume it the exact same way. And that's why it gets a little bit confusing in that sense, where like what is an API and that definition. But regardless of the confusion, it is kind of like exactly the same thing. The way you consume an API can be very different, and I'll touch on that a little bit. But another thing that you brought up that's kind of really important, and something that I actually missed, is the fact that like that core file idea or the driver idea. So my suggestion to everyone out there, if you're serious about doing full stack development, if you're serious about doing backend development, before you jump into something like Strapi, or before you jump into something like full-on WordPress development or something like that, my suggestion would be to go in and create your own something really simple API with routes and stuff like that, whether it be with NodeJS or Laravel or just straight PHP, doesn't matter. Just do it something with a more base language, because it'll give you an appreciation and understanding of what's going on when you're actually using one of these services. Because when you're creating something like a Node application, you create routes inside of Node, and those routes essentially are the APIs. So you create like a slash users route, right? And inside of that slash users, what you're doing is when a user types in your domain and does a slash users, it'll hit that route, and then you can put whatever logic you need to happen inside of that slash users function, the route function. And inside that logic, you would probably put something like return all users, return all the users in the database. So you would have a database call, open your database connection, grab all the users from the database, and then send back as a response to the API call the users. And then the front end would do whatever you want with it. But the idea that I'm trying to make is that when you create that with your own two hands, when you go through all the documentation and stuff like that, and then you switch over to something like Strapi, every time you're using one of the APIs, you make that connection immediately. And you're like, oh, okay, so now I'm authenticating a user. Oh yeah, that's right. Inside of Node, when I did that, I had to use this route. I had to use this this functionality of that route to be able to see if it's authenticated or not. And when you have issues, even with something like Strapi, which is, again, I'll explain in a second, even when you have something simple as Strapi, you know exactly where you're going to need to look. Whereas if you haven't done the base configuration, like the base understanding of how an API works, it's going to be a lot harder to debug it because you don't know where that, that disconnect will be most of the time. Like if you have an issue, you're like, oh, I don't know what's going on in the back end. I'm going to have to get a professional in here to figure out what's going on in the back end. Otherwise, I'm going to have to, kind of go line by line. So again, it's good that you brought that up, Matt. That is a great suggestion, is to go back, in my opinion, and learn the basics. And I'm not saying create a whole massive application in it. I'm saying do a few routes in Node, connect some sort of really simple front end that doesn't have to be styled or anything like that, that can, interact with the back end, and then maybe write to it and then display something on the front end or something like that. Really simple. And as soon as you do that, I'm telling you, as soon as you do that, you'll have that aha moment and that connection and be like, okay, now I get what Strapi is. Now I understand what it's trying to do because it's doing all those things for you. And again, so to get into what Strapi is and how it does it, and like how it helps, Strapi is a headless CMS tool, which helps you accelerate the creation of APIs. And a headless CMS, again, we've talked about this before, but it means it's essentially just a backend service. So built on Node, Strapi is built on Node, and an admin portal, a front-end admin portal built on React that generates endpoints for you and connects it to whatever front-end actual application that you like. So again, the admin portal is something that Strapi helps you generate. And then the backend connections with the databases and the actual server routing is another thing that Strapi sets up for you right from the get-go. So again, it helps you get started with all of the API considerations that I've mentioned. So everything that I mentioned, start to finish, I was able to do inside of Strapi with no code writing. All I had to do was essentially download the project, run the project. I had to learn how to do that. There is a little bit of a setup process, but once I was figured out how to run the project, everything that needed to be done, all the correlation, all the user creation technology, everything like that, all the endpoints were generated for me from the admin dashboard. And I could edit all of the different collection types. I could edit all the different, weekly growth goal posts, like what goes in a weekly growth goal. Well, I have to make sure that it's associated with a user. I have to make sure that there's a weekly growth goal string in there because obviously you're going to want to put in a weekly growth goal in there. I have to make sure there's a date in there. All of that I could do from Strapi's own admin portal, which it generates for you. So that's the power of something like a headless CMS, and especially something like Strapi. So it's managed from a user interface, and it provides the interface, again, is built with React. So even if I did have to go in and do some sort of custom functionality, I'm able to do that because, you go into the React files, everything is open source. So you can go right into the React files and edit it and make your own kind of adjustments. You can white label it all you want because it is open source. And they give you that ability. It gives you an out-of-the-box media editor. So when you're uploading media to it, it will allow you to kind of crop it, to adjust it slightly and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden, it also generates APIs for your media. So I don't know, Matt, were you saying before? Oh, no, I think before the podcast, we were talking about how WordPress handles media. So it doesn't upload it and then just generate you one URL. It actually generates you multiple different URLs for different use cases. So if you need a thumbnail, it'll generate you a separate URL for a thumbnail. If you need a pre-cached image where it's kind of a little bit blurry and Gaussian before it loads, it'll generate you that as well. It'll generate you a full image. It'll generate you a medium-sized image for your phones and stuff like that. It generates all that for you, and it has that that functionality built in right off the bat. And it has all the blog creation tools that you could want as well. Rich field text boxes, markdown editors, all that is built into the initial Strapi configuration. And you can obviously extend it as much as you want, add your own custom functionality, whether it be let's say you have functionality in there that every time you post a blog post, you needed to go in and check your server to make sure that it doesn't interfere with any of your other blog posts. Let's say you post something about, Strapi version 2. And what you want to do is you want to go into your database, make sure that you haven't posted exactly that Strapi version 2 before. You can write a middleware, and they give you all the tools that you need for that to be able to go into your database after you hit the post button and verify that there isn't anything else in there, and then send back an error or whatever if there is. So you can do that if you want. Yeah, so because it's open source and because it's self-hosted, it actually gives you the ability to host it wherever you want. So anything that has a VPS service like DigitalOcean, Heroku, AWS, Azure, all of that is open for you. It doesn't hold any of your data, if that makes sense. It actually gives you the ability to use whatever database that you want. It has the interfaces to work with MongoDB, SQL, Postgres, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the different databases and connect straight to its own backend system. Strapi has a bunch of starter projects, both with Vue, React, Flutter, a bunch of different front ends that you could possibly consider. And you don't need a starter project to get started. It's fairly easy to get started. If you want to just do like straight JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, you can absolutely do that with Strapi. But again, if you want to make something really quickly, a starter project, how it helps is like you can, just open up your starter project, download it, and see how they made that connection. So how are they calling data from Strapi? How are they posting data to the Strapi front end? You can see how it's already done, and then just use those functions in your own code and kind of, copy paste a lot of the functionality, only do minor adjustments on the actual connection front. How
is this thing running? Like, so not to interrupt, but you mentioned DigitalOcean, Heroku, AWS, Azure. Mm-hmm. Can you run this thing on something that's like super common? Let's say you just buy a shared hosting cPanel that's like, Linux with Apache and the works.
No, you
cannot.
You cannot run this on a shared hosting platform with Apache or Nginx. You can run the front end on it. So if you want to run your website on Nginx or Apache, you can absolutely do that. But the back end has to run on a VPS.
Right. So what do we know, or do you know, I guess, what it is? Like, so it's not like PHP then?
It's Node.
It's Node. Okay. So that's the reason.
That's the reason. Correct.
That's the reason. Okay.
That's the reason. Yeah. So it's just a Node. It's using Node in the back end, whatever database that you want as the database, and then React as the front end application that connects to that back end for the admin portal.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, that's why it needs a whole thing, but it has one-click installs, I believe, for both DigitalOcean and Heroku. I haven't done that yet. I have that on my list of things to do, and it's in my Trello board that Matt mentioned at the start of the episode. So you can check out the progress there and see where I'm at with the production deployment. But the idea that I have is I want to create everything locally, make sure that everything works locally, and then I'm going to spend, it's probably going to take me a day or two to get everything ported over to some sort of service. So I'll either go with Heroku because it has a free tier, or maybe I'll open up like another $5 DigitalOcean droplet or something like that. I haven't really decided yet. I'm leaning towards Heroku because I haven't used it yet and I want to try it out. And again, that free tier, this is something that I want to do, like especially when we launch the site. But one of my future projects is going to be how to create a free project without having to pay for the domain, without having to pay for the hosting, without having to pay anything, right? Until you actually are generating income. So that's going to be one of my future, blog posts or maybe video series. I'm not sure how I'm going to handle it, but that's something that I want to do is create something with the lowest budget possible and still be able to run it effectively, still be fast, still be extensible, and then be able to scale if it needs to scale, essentially.
I have a question for you, actually, and this is slightly off topic, but also kind of on topic as well. And I guess it kind of plays to poses a question, I suppose, to your free project idea and this like cloud hosting idea, basically. So to me, hosting, like if you just say the term hosting, the first thing that comes to mind is still a cPanel, Linux, of whatever distro with, like Apache and the works. You have your SQL databases, your MySQL databases, you have your email access, and like your cPanel gives you all these tools to access all these things and all the rest of it. And to me, that's still when someone says hosting, that's the first thing that comes to mind. Do you think that these other hosting services, so DigitalOcean, Heroku, like I know you said there is some one-click installers for Strapi, which is very reminiscent of sort of that traditional host that I just laid out, the cPanel one. Do you think that cloud hosting effectively is what I call DigitalOcean and these other services? That's basically what I call it. So do you think that these quote-unquote cloud hosting services are going to become more commonplace as sort of that de facto, like I'm using hosting and it's going to play a role there? Or do you see sort of the traditional cPanel hosting being the de facto hosting kind of moving forward. And the reason why I ask that is because I think for a new user, especially since like, we're talking to people that are brand new with APIs, if they decide to try an API, like they want to try just making like that sort of beta program that you mentioned where it's like, oh, just use PHP or whatever you want and try to connect to a MySQL database. A lot of these people that, are trying to getting into this will oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes have just sort of some shared hosting setup because maybe they have a site or two on there via reseller or add-on domains or what have you. And so they're going to be locked out because they have to effectively go to one of these other services. So do you see hosting, and I know this is sort of a big question, but do you see hosting as something that is going to change over to these sort of quote unquote cloud hosting services like DigitalOcean and friends? Or because the way I'm seeing it is if you go to just a hosting website, and they're all different, but let's just say in general, you go to a hosting website and you go to buy hosting from them. They just say like, oh, host your website here, host your WordPress here, host your this, host your that. But there's nothing that's very clear in the marketing and such that says we don't run Node or we don't run this or we don't run that. And that's, I think, maybe what makes these sort of, again, quote unquote, cloud hosting services so niche or so technical, because it's from the layman or from a beginner's perspective, it's really unclear what the difference is. And it's very, it seems like DigitalOcean and friends are very advanced, and they can be. Now with these one-click installs, they are getting there, getting more like the cPanel guys, I guess. But I'm just curious, like, what's your take on that? Like are companies like Strapi, obviously they're running on Node, but like, are they leaving the door open when it comes to like, maybe they should have a PHP version for these shared hostings? Or do you see sort of that traditional cPanel or whatever sort of Linux, blah, 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 shared hosting model sort of going away and everyone sort of getting in on this, again, quote unquote, cloud hosting model?
So I don't see it going away completely, but just to put it out there, AWS and Azure are VPSs, and they're like, I'm pretty sure AWS is Amazon's number one moneymaker. So in that, the trend is definitely going to digital, like to VPS services, and stuff like Heroku, stuff like DigitalOcean is making the other stuff also extremely accessible. But again, I don't think it's going to, like, I don't think these shared hosting services are going away completely, for sure, because again, we talk about WordPress all the time. That's not going away. That has to be hosted on those services. On the other hand, a lot of what's happening for people to kind of own their own stuff and not have to worry about shared hosting, they are buying like, Azure or AWS cloud, like VPS or dedicated VPS machines, and putting their own versions of cPanel on that, and then hosting WordPress and stuff, like large agencies.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like to be clear to the audience, when I say shared hosting, that's the first step. Like you can have a VPS that's running cPanel, Linux, and all that stuff. Like I said, you can also have a dedicated doing the same thing, but usually you start at the shared, so that's kind of what gets associated with it.
And the other thing about the starting, I think a lot of new developers nowadays are actually starting with like the Netlify and the DigitalOcean or the Netlify and Heroku stack. Mm-hmm. At least that's what it seems like on the whole, like, dev.to and Reddit and everything else that I'm reading. A lot of people are foregoing even starting on the shared hosting. They're just going straight to a Netlify or GitHub Pages approach directly connected to some sort of VPS. So the trend, I would say, is definitely going towards the VPS services, because the other reason for it is new developers that want to do full stack. It's easier for them to learn JavaScript and then just use JavaScript in the back end, right? So that's why Node is kind of becoming more and more popular. And then this new TypeScript, not a TypeScript version of Node, but like a new backend service is becoming popular as well that runs TypeScript, called Deno, and is also built on the same kind of principles that Node is. So it's also going to need to be VPS'd. But again, this is the trend. Obviously, there's still tons and tons and tons of people using regular traditional hosting platforms with cPanel and other versions of cPanel. Like I know cPanel had a whole big thing where it increased their prices by 1,000%. So now there's other versions of cPanel, other types of cPanels running around that are kind of a disaster.
Like Plesk and stuff. Although Plesk is
Exactly.
pretty good. Like it's usable and all that.
Plesk
like, it's
is usable. There's other open source ones that are really bad. We've recently had some interaction with them, but regardless, so there's that still going on. Definitely 100%. And there's still a lot of it. I don't know if it's going anywhere personally. I just think like the new trend that I'm seeing at least, and this might just be something that's kind of just happening in the dev blog sphere, because we know that they move very differently in very different directions than
that's
the
what
industry.
I'm worried about too. Yeah. Continue, but yeah.
Yeah. I think, exactly. I think they move in very different directions, but it has been happening for the last 4 or 5 years. So I would say it's pretty consistently moving towards VPSs. And it's becoming easier and easier, like you said, with the one-click installs. And like I mentioned, it's becoming a lot easier. Docker is bringing it a little bit more forward as well, allowing you to kind of have one installation for everything else. Now, I'm not going to go with Docker this time. I have some issues with Docker, and I'll get into that in a different episode because it's too much of a tangent. But there's a lot that Docker does great, and a lot that it seems like it's not ready. Like if I was in an industry if I was in a enterprise environment and I was running Docker, I would be panicked 100% of the time. Like that's just my feeling of it, and people can correct me and attack me if I'm wrong on that, and they've had like perfect experiences with it. But I haven't met anyone that had like an amazing experience all the time with Docker. I've met a lot of people that are very like passionate about it and love it and use it every day. But if you kind of probe them a little bit, it's always like, oh yeah, I have those issues too. So it's just one of those things that's just not. I don't think it's done yet. I think they're going to make it even better, and that's what I'm waiting for before I use it. So I'm gonna go with just the regular hosting kind of approach through Heroku and the one-click app install. Hopefully it works, and I'll be reporting on that. That is something that I'm worried about because I hate deployment stuff, I hate production stuff, and one thing that I will be leaning on you, Matt, is just DNS help.
Oh, I can do that.
Yeah, I'll just need help with pointing the DNS to my server, and I'll give you like all the information. But I think with that, just to let everyone know, the reason that I've doing this episode is because I am using Strapi currently in the weekly growth goals application, and I was able to create users programmatically from my front end, which is Vue 3.0, send login requests, create weekly goals, get all the weekly goals. All of that was done through Strapi and all through the GUI. I have not touched the code yet, which is why I'm so impressed with it, right? And that's not to say that there's other services are worse or anything like that. But I'm just like, I've used Sanity before, and that's what I want to talk about in the next segment. I just want to do a comparison. And I've also done, obviously, the custom, Node.js creation of APIs. So I have some insight into like the different variances of how you create an API in the JavaScript world. So I just want to talk about that real quick. So again, plenty of ways to build APIs. We've covered Sanity.io before, and it's still a great option, honestly. Like, it's really good. But it has a different use case, in my opinion. Sanity actually hosts your data for you. So they have their own managed service that will host your data, your database, and even your admin portal if you want. They do give you an option to host your admin portal yourself, but they do give you that like admin portal hosting as well if you want it. And what this allows is really quick production environment setup. So everything that Matt was just talking about, or Matt and I were just talking about with DigitalOcean and all that, that's not required with Sanity. You don't need to do it. It's all hosted for you. It's all done for you. They have a generous free tier, so you can get started and up and running really quickly. You don't have to worry about where you're going to host your backend, where you're going to host your database. They manage that for you. But the issue is, if you start to become big, if you start to need to have custom functionality, if you start to need more control over your data, it becomes more of those things like, well, how do I do that? Like, how do I get access to my data? Now I'm relying on Sanity. If Sanity goes down or Sanity goes out of business, I'm done, right? Because you're not touching the data of it. Like, you're only interacting through their own APIs that they've created with the data. So it has its uses, in my opinion, but again, it's one of those things where, like, if you're worried about your data, if you think this project is going to have a long lead time, and you might switch different front ends, you might switch to different back ends in the future or something like that, then that's why I kind of wanted to try out Strapi, because again, Strapi is fully open source. It does have a paid tier, but the only difference as far as I could see is that it gives you more roles. So when you create users, you're given 3 roles for free. So you can have like an editor, an admin, and then like a regular user or something like that. I can't remember what the 3 roles are, but regardless, those are the general 3 roles. But as soon as you want to get more complicated and you want like 30 roles, you have to start paying per month for Strapi as well. But for something like the weekly growth goals application, all I really need is the ability to be authenticated and not authenticated. I don't really care about all the different roles. Like I don't need to have one user see more weekly growth goals than another user. If I had that kind of, stipulation, then I would have to probably pay for it. But other than that, everything else is free. Like you own your data, you own the code that you write, and you can white label it as you want, because again, it's open source. All the code is ready for you to edit yourself.
What is your, sorry, so with that, I actually have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your take on APIs versus, okay, so should you be using a pre-made API like Strapi? Should you be using like something that you make yourself? Or should you be using something that isn't an API on the front, but it is something like WordPress or another CMS, where it's like it's not like advertised as an API, but like I said, it's like in the workings of it somewhere, right? What is your sort of take on when you should sort of pull the trigger on those 3 options? So like make your own, something like Strapi, Sanity, whatever, depending on your use case, or something like just a CMS. Like when should you pull the trigger on those 3?
So in my opinion, it depends on the complexity of the projects and the customization requirements. If the person comes up to me and says that they want a super modern website with very good performance, really good animation, something that would stand out and perform well, and just like, I don't know, I can't really tell, but like if you go to the Strapi website, even you can see how modern it looks and how great it kind of it performs. You can see that there's just something different about it than something like a generic WordPress or even a Shopify or something like that. It's something that would be difficult to do in a fully controlled and managed CMS system. Not that it's impossible. I'm sure it's possible to do, because there's a lot of customizations you can make yourself. But regardless, it's like, if someone were to come up to me and be like, "Oh, I want you to go to strapi.io. I want you to make me something as eye-catching and as performant as this website," I would lean towards going the custom build route. And custom build, not necessarily like fully Node.js from scratch and stuff like that. I would go with a custom front end, like a Vue.js front end with animation libraries built in and stuff like that, because it would just be a lot more difficult to replicate and not make janky like a Shopify or a WordPress would be. Because I've done animations and stuff like that in Shopify recently, and it's always like, they have one use case that they want you to use, and if you want to change it, it's going to look janky. So that's my front thought there. Creating your own complete like backend infrastructure, that to me would be like, okay, I need the utmost security. I need the utmost control over my data. I need the most, I don't know. I need the most I need to make it obscure as heck so that people can't hack it easily and stuff like that. So it's one of those things where, like, if the budget permits and you have the team of experienced backend engineers, you can do a lot with a custom backend. Like, you can do whatever the heck you want, right? And you don't have any overhead because you're only building the routes that you need at that point. Whereas with like a WordPress,
although you have overhead in money.
Yes,
because you're paying a bunch of engineers, but you don't have overhead in that, like,
money and time, obviously.
But you don't have overhead in API functions that you don't use.
No, exactly. So it's one of those balances. Like, if a large company came to me and I had a team of engineers that were able to do it, and they were like, I need this to be as secure as possible, et cetera, then I would probably lean towards the custom build route on the back end as well. that's where it goes. Like maybe enterprise level stuff, or maybe like a startup with a decent amount of seed money that wants to grow, right? So if a startup comes to you and they're in the very early stages of their rounds and they're already like, tens and 20 and 30 million dollars into their rounds, and they're like, well, we need a platform that can work now, but we can also extend as fast as possible, then and as much as possible, then maybe a custom build route works for them too, because it's obviously the most extensible one.
And the thing is too, is like enterprises have such specific use cases.
Yes.
That if you're a person that's like, none of these APIs, like services or none of these CMSs do what I want, then it's like, at that point, it's like, okay, you either have to start looking for an enterprise CMS, which I assume is out there somewhere because there's enterprise CMSs, enterprise APIs. So look at the enterprise grade of your stuff. And if that doesn't exist, then you got to build it.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the other consideration would be like, what kind of systems am I interfacing with? Am I interfacing with, a mainframe? Am I interfacing with a old Java-based, database system that is from like the 90s? Stuff like that. That I would also lean towards custom build for that if I have to interface with it on the back end side, because I would just write a middleware that can, interact with it.
Well, also too is if you're trying to get information and let's say it's legal, let's be serious, but like let's be fair here. But let's say you're trying to get information from a service and it's legal to do so, but there is no API, then you have to write your own type of thing. You know what I mean? Like whether it's through somehow accessing their database with their permission or whatever it is, you may have to. Those are times where you would have to build your own for sure.
I think that's exactly it. So like, again, it's those really special use cases where it just makes more sense and you have the time and you have the money and you have the correct team of engineers, because you're going to need engineers. You can't do it with like a bunch of, self-taught web developers to be able to build a whole system like that. Like you're going to need if you're self-taught, you're going to need to be self-taught in data structures and algorithms, self-taught in all the different systems, like design patterns and stuff like that, because it's just when you get into the weeds of a from scratch build backend system, you're going to see how far the rabbit hole goes.
Yeah. I think that's a good sum up. APIs are super interesting. APIs are something that we, most of us use. APIs are something that are invisible or right in your face. They're public or private, whatever. And it's important that you know about them. Like, even if you're not a person that's like the engineer, like Mike said, that knows all the data structures and stuff like that, of which I am not, and of which Mike is not, kind of. You've done some classes, but like you're not full.
Yeah, I'm not a full.
I don't know what the official title would be. I was trying to think of it, but I actually don't know what it is.
Computer science. It would be computer science or software engineering full on.
Like a data scientist too, or something. Like exactly. You might need one of them on staff, or maybe you might need a couple staff members here at this point. But, but like you can get into the weeds to your own degree. Like obviously the weeds could be like, oh, I need a way to create accounts. Oh, I need admin role versus user role. Oh, I need this page to look different when there's an admin role and when the person's like a regular user. Oh, I need this editor to be viewable by this person, but not like, those are the weeds enough to get into it to like, and then you could be, using APIs like API tools like Strapi, or, building your own really simple ones or what have you. But yeah, you can get super, super, super deep into the weeds on this type of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
But beyond that, I'm sorry if I sound a little nasally. My nose started profusely bleeding when Mike was talking, so I have a Kleenex stuffed up my nose at the moment. And it's an old Kleenex that was used as a coaster, so it's very dusty and it smells horrible.
That's bad.
Yeah, it's horrible. It's really bad, actually. There's blood on my hands as well, so that's good. But anyway, so sorry if I sound a little nasally. I had a little bit of apparently a random medical emergency. But anyway, I think it's time for our weekly growth goals, Mike. I think we talked a lot about APIs and all the hosting and stuff like that. So we had the same one this week. And it was finish our bookkeeping. Now, Mike and I have three. I'm not going to get into the weeds of our finances due to like security and such, but basically have three distinct areas that we sort of tackle, because we have an accountant that does all the government stuff, because I don't know what I'm doing. But we just, put in our like, we bought this, we charged this person money, that type of stuff. So we have three sort of distinct separations. Mike has expenses that he like goes through and does all that stuff. I have expenses in which I go through and I do all that stuff, like business expenses, like if I need a mouse, if I need a computer, if I need a hosting service, whatever. And the same thing with him. So we have finished our goal this week in that we have finished our separate things. So the third thing, because I did say there were 3, the third thing is just sort of going through and knocking out all of our miscellaneous business stuff. So if Mike and I together work on a project and we charge a customer for it, it's kind of like joint jurisdiction and there's like money in the account. And it's like, where's this money coming from? Well, obviously you just, we just need to organize all that. So we've done that. And so at least my weekly growth goal is to finish that third part of the bookkeeping and then submit. Yeah, I mean, year end. Boring, but true. I don't know about you, Mike. Same thing, I assume.
Yeah, exactly. It was the same thing for me. I kind of just grounded out over the weekend and a little bit yesterday. I hate it, but again, it's when you're done, one of the things, like you get this little check mark in QuickBooks. Matt and I were talking about before and it feels so good to get that check mark when you're actually done all of the line items in one of the accounts. And that kind of drove me to do more. And I finished a few things. And again, like Matt said, all we have to do is kind of match up, like, why did we withdraw from the account here? And why, when the money came into this account, where did it come from? What invoice is it matching? So we just have to match essentially what money's in the account with the invoices that we have. And I think that's about it.
Yeah,
so,
it's not chaos. Like, to be clear to everybody, it's not like we're doing all our bookkeeping at the end of the year. We have all of the receipts, set aside, whatever. We have the receipts set aside or available to us. We have because usually they're just emailed to us. Let's be serious. We know what the accounts are. We know what days the monthly transactions are happening. So basically all we're doing is taking all the pieces that we already have. It's not like we're looking, be like, where the hell are these receipts? Like, no, we know where they are. They're there. It's just basically like, now it's being like, okay, this receipt did this and it charged tax and this is how much it was and it has this and then yes, you know what I mean? Like just putting it together is basically what we're doing right now. So we've done our separate things. Now we're on the togetherness part. So that's good. Good progress. Literally has to be done. So there's literally no excuse at this point. Still our weekly growth goal. But if you have a weekly growth goal yourself, please, reach out. Tell us on the old socials, comment, DM us, whatever, tweet at us, whatever it is. Just let us know what you're doing. # weekly growth goals. Let's make some stuff happen and make some cool stuff. And I think that's really it. Short of kind of announcing the web news. And the web news this week, which is going to be coming out hopefully tomorrow, is Matt, my number one UX tip. My number one UX tip, something you should always follow, something that you should always at least consider, something that you should always keep at the back of your mind, and something that you almost always hit when you're doing testing. So a little bit of a teaser there, but tune in tomorrow and I'll give you that tip. Same place, this RSS feed, this podcast app, whatever, it'll be released. And remember, we're on Patreon. If you want to support the show, that's patreon.com/HTML all the things. Check out those tiers, give that a go. And many thanks to our $3 tier patron, Sean from RabbitWorks JavaScript via youtube.com/RabbitWorks JavaScript, Garrick from Local Path Computing and Web Design via localpathcomputing.com, Ryan Gatchell from Blue Black Digital via blueblackdigital.com, Chris from Self-Made Web Designer via selfmadewebdesigner.com, Tim from The Web Hacker via thewebhacker.com, DL Ford from dlford.io, Bib Hashdash from 9block Media via 9blockmedia.com, and Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com. Feel free to leave a comment or review on the platform that you are listening to this on. And this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things Podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media. On Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.